And now for the big mistake that I made during the video, which was pointed out by many of you. I can't believe that I got this wrong, but hello and welcome to the After Action Report, where I go through your comments and we dive deeper into last week's video. Last week we discussed the Battle of Crete. If you haven't watched that video yet, I highly recommend checking it out, and I will pin it in the top comment down below. Thank you to everyone who has watched last week's video. The response has been incredible. This was the first video that I posted since coming back to the channel, and the comments have been overwhelmingly positive. So thank you to everybody. Now, those of you who are new here, my name is Matt. I am a professional battlefield guide, and this channel is my opportunity to take you with me as we explore history. Now, in the comments, there were a lot of really great discussion points which I wanted to highlight in this video. A lot of the discussion focused around the role of the command of Bernard Freyberg, as well as some of the missed intelligence opportunities. And this is where I wanted to begin by highlighting the comment made by Paul Nemo. He writes, "There's another important story behind what happened at Crete. The British High Command knew well in advance that there would be an airborne invasion. They even knew where the drop zones were because they had already cracked the Enigma code. The issue was if they appeared too well prepared for the invasion, then the Germans would have known that the Enigma code was broken. This would have been disastrous for the Allies, especially with Overlord in its infancy." Not sure if Overlord would have been in planning yet, but certainly, you could argue that some plans around retaking the mainland could have been underway, certainly. Freyberg was heavily criticised for the response to the invasion and cost to troops, but he was under strict orders not to give the indication to the German invading forces that they had prior knowledge. This meant, of course, only a few of his immediate subordinates knew about the coming invasion, and they were told not to pass this down the line, just in case they were captured. The need to maintain the illusion that the Enigma was still intact took precedence, and as a result, many allies paid the ultimate price. Freyberg was, of course, governed by the Official Secrets Act and could not divulge the reasons for the apparent failure, often being openly criticised for what had happened. Only after his death, when the documents were declassified, did the truth come out, and it is still not known about generally. This is one of the reasons the Allies seemed either too slow in their decision or indecisive, or in some locations over-prepared. It must have been horrific for Freyberg knowing what was coming and not being able to tell his men. Now, this is a part of the Battle of Crete that's still oftentimes hard to believe. British intelligence, thanks to the success of Operation Ultra, the code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park, actually knew the Germans were coming to invade Crete. They'd cracked the Enigma codes. They had intercepted messages showing that a major airborne assault was coming. They even identified likely drop zones, Maleme, Rethemnia, Heraklion, as well as rough timing. So with that kind of warning, the obvious question is, why weren't the Allies better prepared? Well, it all comes down to how that intelligence was used, and more accurately, how cautious the British were about acting on it, right? Like this commenter points out. And another commenter then also points out, from Kenneth Busettel, Ultra had informed the Commonwealth High Command that there was a pending attack. The need to protect Ultra was vital. One such example earlier in the war was the German bombing of Coventry. Through Ultra, it was known in advance, yet the alarm was not raised, causing a much higher number of civilians killed that could have been prevented. Now, I actually looked into Coventry in this particular bombing raid. Maybe a bit nitpicking here, but Coventry was still disputed as to whether or not it was known. However, what is correct is that the broader bombing raids were known in advance, yet no additional ground-to-air defense was made, right, again, to protect Ultra. And so here we have another example where a controversial decision is made to protect Ultra, which ultimately costs lives. Now, it's easy for me to armchair this, right, after the fact, but I would be interested to know, if you were in command, would you have risked exposing Ultra to save lives, like those in the UK bombing raids, or would you have kept it secret to protect the long-term advantage? Let me know in the comments. But going back to Crete, obviously, only a small handful of commanders on the island were told about the Ultra intercepts. Most frontline officers weren't. The fear that if the Germans realised the Enigma had been compromised, they'd change their encryption, and then of course Ultra would go dark. So instead of alerting all the units, the British tried to disguise Ultra sources and pass it off as intel, as like reconnaissance rumours. Things like this. And so most frontline commanders, including Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, who we was on Hill 107, who we spoke about in the video, he didn't have the full picture. And so the Allied defences were prepared more for a conventional amphibious landing and not for the airborne assault, which ultimately came. Worse still, even when the paratroopers began dropping from the sky, some commanders assumed that it was just a diversion and that the real attack was still coming by sea. Now, to be fair, an amphibious landing was planned to reinforce the German paratroopers, but it was insufficient, or insignificant maybe is a better word, compared to the airborne assault in terms of scale and equipment. Right, the Germans had tried to land their forces using fishing boats and motor barges, not exactly Normandy. Plus, the German amphibious landing was absolutely crushed by the British Navy. They never even made it to the beaches. Now, the Allies had the intelligence, but they couldn't or wouldn't act on it fully. And, it's that hesitation and that initial indecisiveness, despite having forewarning, which ultimately sets the stage for everything that follows. Now, intelligence alone, of course, can't win battles. It comes down to decision-making and boots on the ground. And there was a lot of criticism of Major General Bernard Freyberg, his rank at the time. One commenter, who really didn't hold back any punches, was left by Jimmy. He writes, "My dad, 1st Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, tasked as a sniper on Crete, was wounded and captured on Crete. I edited his memoirs and researched the battle. In my opinion, Freyberg was almost as incompetent as Percival, the Commonwealth commander in Singapore. The Navy stopped any seaborne invasion at great cost. They did. And he was warned of the impending air attack, but he stayed in his HQ and didn't keep a grip on the battle. He had the troops to defend Crete, but failed. Another one of Churchill's generals. On the New Zealand side, Hargest, who allowed the retreat from Hill 107, wasn't supposed to be serving overseas and was another political appointment." So Jimmy's point here really highlights a lot of the criticisms of the top-level leadership, particularly around Freyberg. And there was a lot of discussion on this topic. I've highlighted Jimmy's comment here because of a comment that was in the reply thread, which I'll actually get to. But first, let's have a look at some of the criticisms of Freyberg, or Freyberg. Freyberg, I think, is more accurate. First, he misjudged the main threat, right? It has been widely criticised, or he's been widely criticised for his belief that the Germans would attempt a seaborne invasion, despite the intelligence from Ultra indicating that the main assault was going to come by the air. Now, this led him to prioritise defending against sea landings and the beaches without concentrating sufficient forces, particularly around the Maleme airfield. This also then leads into, obviously, the second one, which we discussed, the handling of intelligence. Now, again, this is tough because, despite having access to the highly accurate intelligence, defenders of Freyberg argue that he wasn't able to fully act on the warnings because he felt constrained by the security concerns, right? He believed that he was not authorized to redeploy his forces based solely on this intelligence. I've also read accounts that they say Freyberg wasn't given the full picture as well, so this also can play a part. But the real meat and potatoes of it all really is tactical errors. Historians and contemporaries, including several of Freyberg's subordinate commanders, faulted him for poor tactical decision-making. A major error was leaving the area west of the Travonitis River and part of the Maleme airfield less defended, which allowed the German paratroopers to establish a vital early foothold. The delayed counterattacks on the 21st and 22nd to retake the airfield and Hill 107, I mentioned it in the video, right? This was in part because of the fear of a seaborne landing. Next, and I suppose ultimately the major criticism of Freyberg is his leadership and communication. Several of Freyberg's subordinates accused him of failing to keep proper control over the operation and not sufficiently consulting his senior officers. This also goes back to his tactical errors and leaving uncertainty about his intentions. One really good example of this is unclear orders around destroying the Maleme airfield. It wasn't clear, if they should do it, when they should do it, and how they should do it. And so this uncertainty leads to obviously a lot of knock-on effects and other mistakes. Many of Freyberg's detractors have also criticised his remote or often detached leadership, associating his command from headquarters, seen as really kind of detached from the front line, not getting that timely intelligence from frontline commanders who are seeing what's going on in real time on the ground. Now, it's important though to contextualize this because, it's easy for me to armchair critique this 80 plus years after the fact and when, we have all the information, we have the value of hindsight, but it's worth noting some of the challenges that Freyberg faced here as well. Now, historians have often argued that Crete was doomed from the beginning and Freyberg inherited an impossible situation. The troops were exhausted, right? They'd just come off the Greek campaign. They had limited resources in terms of armor, vehicles, and heavy weapons. Most of this was left behind on the Greek mainland. The RAF were almost non-existent during the entire campaign of Crete, and the German Luftwaffe had complete control over the skies. Now, there's one thing, though, that I did really want to highlight attention to about Freyberg and pay him credit for. That was left by another commenter, which was down below Jimmy's comment, and this was left by Andrew. And he writes, "At least Freyberg stayed and fought. The Aussie guy, Blamey, took his son, also an officer, and fled the island to Alexandria. I lost a lot of respect for him after hearing that." Now, when I read this, I was quite shocked, as I didn't know this. Now, for those of you who maybe don't know, Blamey was the commander of the Australian forces in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, including on Crete, and he would later go on to command the Australian forces during the Pacific campaign. I have a lot of trouble pronouncing the word Pacific. I'm not sure why. But when I read Andrew's comment, like I said, I didn't know this. And while I was researching the video, I mostly followed in the footsteps of the New Zealanders. And so after reading this, I naturally just Googled Blamey evacuation of Crete. Turns out, Blamey actually saw the writing on the wall for the fall of Crete relatively early and began making plans for the evacuation, which with hindsight actually turned out well for the Allies as they were able to evacuate more troops than perhaps otherwise could have been saved with a last minute kind of evacuation. But here's where things get spicy. Blamey lost a lot of his credibility when he chose his son Tom to fill one of the remaining seats on the aircraft, carrying him and others out of Greece. Now, my criticism of Blamey here isn't that he chose his son to be on that plane. I think any father would have done the same thing. And this just really reinforces the fact that family members should not serve under the same chain of command or even in the same unit. I mentioned during the video, right, the story of those 3 German brothers who were killed on the same day. Just tragic stories. But my criticism here is that Blamey was also on the plane, right? He was the commander of the Australians on Crete. Freyberg, for all of his criticisms, he stayed until the last ship out. And I think that's worth highlighting, as oftentimes we can, overlook many of these small leadership traits that, are also very important to highlight. Now, I just wanted to maybe leave it there. I think it's probably gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to. And next, I wanted to jump into some of the human stories and family connections. Many of you actually shared personal connection stories of fathers, uncles, and grandfathers who fought on Crete, both from the German and the Allied side, and I really enjoy reading these, so thank you to everybody who shared their story. And so I just wanted to go through a few of them. The first one here is by Leslie Smore. He writes, assuming it's a he, "My grandfather was in Heraklion after retreating from Greece. He said they weren't very well armed, but managed to get some of the weapons the Germans were dropping, and he had a field day picking off the paratroopers before they reached the ground." Oof. And that just paints a horrible picture, doesn't it? Right, of the vulnerability of the paratroopers as they leave their aircraft. This is, you can picture just how vulnerable you would be in that parachute and how horrible that situation must have been. He said that they had the area under control until the stupid Poms abandoned the airfield, which turns out it was the Kiwis. He may have known that, but chose to blame the Poms anyway. This line really kind of stuck out to me a little bit because, as an Australian, we tend to blame the Brits for everything. Stub your toe in the middle of the night. It was the British, right? They put the piece of furniture there. But what this invoked in me initially when I read this was other criticisms that the Australians have of the British, particularly around kind of the First World War and Gallipoli. We oftentimes blame the British for landing the Commonwealth forces on the wrong beaches and the most heavily defended part of the coastline. But what we forget is that the British were also part of that Gallipoli campaign. They were also on those same beaches. And so it was just funny that his instinct is just to blame the Poms right off the bat. He continues. He hid with the locals for a period of time, then escaped with some other Aussies on a boat they acquired somehow. About halfway to Egypt, they got stopped by an Italian submarine. The submarine couldn't take everyone, so they took the officers. He was captured and was taken back to Italy. Those who remained on the boat made it back to Egypt and rejoined the Australian troops stationed there. My grandfather spent most of the war as a POW in Italy, which he said wasn't too bad. The last year he got transferred to Germany, which he didn't speak very fondly of. Yeah, I mean, the last war as a POW by the Germans must have been pretty horrific. Of course, they barely had resources for themselves, and POWs were quite badly, poorly mistreated toward those late stages. But what I wanted to highlight with this comment here was, at first, his father was hit by the locals. Right, again, this is such an important part of the Battle of Crete because the locals play such a significant role during the defense of Crete and sort of the ongoing occupation. And the bravery it must have taken for these civilians to hide Commonwealth forces really is something else, because the consequences of being caught is certainly death. I mean, the consequences are just astronomical, yet so many of them risk their lives that way. But then, he continues that they commandeered a boat somehow and then began paddling across the Mediterranean towards Egypt. That in and of itself is pretty ridiculous. Could you imagine, rowing your boat out over the Mediterranean and then to be stopped by a submarine? I mean, what are the odds of that? I mean, just imagine the picture of that, right? I mean, the fiction is stranger than fact here in many ways. And so I just really wanted to point that out as the image of a submarine coming up and, taking the prisoners. It just put a very vivid image in my head. So thank you for sharing that. The next comment that I wanted to highlight comes from Carl Flavel. My grandfather was serving with the Royal Marines when he was captured on Crete by German mountain troops after the fighting in the rear guard to protect the evacuation of Sfakia. He said very little about his time on Crete. I think this is a pretty common of most veterans that era, and even modern today. It's difficult for people to talk about. As I got the impression, it was quite painful for him. Yeah. About the only thing he said was when he arrived at Sfakia, there was no one there except for others who'd been left just milling about. They were taken prisoner, then marched back across the mountain range. They just fought over in the retreat. He spent the next 4 years in German POW camps and thankfully survived the war. So, very glad, Carl, that your grandfather survived the war. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight with this comment was another comment that was made underneath his, which was by Gary Baldy. And he writes, mine too. He was a Royal Marine in the rear guard, and he said that when they got back to the shore, the ships were already disappearing over the horizon. After capture, he went to a POW camp in Yugoslavia. All the documentaries I've seen about the Battle of Crete, not a single one of them mentions these Royal Marines who were left behind. And this is why I wanted to mention these two comments in particular, because they highlight an element of the Battle of Crete, which, yes, oftentimes gets overlooked, and that is the soldiers who were left behind. And this, I think, in part is because this is a very difficult part of the Allied history, right? Oftentimes, the old cliche, the victors write the history, and, there's a tendency there to leave out the areas of the history which are somewhat shameful or difficult for us to handle. And I think, trying to highlight the stories of those who were fighting in those rearguard actions who were then left behind is a harrowing tale that a lot of people just obviously don't want to talk about, because it paints the Allies obviously in a more negative light than they want to try and portray themselves. And so I wanted to highlight these two comments, to highlight these two stories, because you can imagine the heartbreak from these soldiers, right? They fight the rearguard action, getting over the mountain, and then they get to the shore and the ships are gone. Particularly with Gary's grandfather, seeing the ships over the horizon, like that just must have been heartbreaking to see that, to have got that far, think you're going to be evacuated, and all of a sudden you've missed the ships. That just must have been so tragic. And now, because I'm sure this video has gone on for way too long, I wanted to mention some of the more lighter moments and comments. To those of you who are Bren gun fans, you're absolutely right. It is a light machine gun, not a submachine gun. I got the comment here from Longstreet. Sorry to be an armchair nerd, but the Bren gun was an LMG, light machine gun, not an SMG. Thanks for catching that. You were right. It was a slip of the tongue, and many of you were very quick off the mark to remind me of this mistake. So thank you for that. And now for the big mistake that I made during the video, which was pointed out by many of you. I can't believe that I got this wrong, but there are no foxes in New Zealand. I didn't know this. There were many comments, but one of the comments here was pointed out by Snodgrass. Great video, thank you. But small point, there are no foxes in New Zealand. I didn't know that. I'd assumed after reading the story about Pink Hill that the New Zealand farmers were great shots because they were protecting livestock, and in Australia you protect livestock from foxes as well as other creatures, of course. But there we go. So I've definitely learned something. So thank you to everybody who pointed that out. But I'll leave it there. Thank you to everybody who commented and added to the discussion. There were a lot of other great comments, and so I would encourage you to go down into the comment section, check it out, join the conversation. My next video will be on the top 10 World War II sites to visit in Munich, birthplace of National Socialism. So if you would like to see that video and more videos from me, please feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.